Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to fit the gearboxes to the chassis plate on the Tamiya Porsche. Right, here we go then. Bag D, or the D bag. Step 25, the lower deck parts. We need the rather nice chassis plate, 2 M3x25 countersunk screws, 7 3x12 countersunk self-tappers, 2 3x10 countersunk self-tappers, 2 steering posts, J13 and 14, the rear battery stops, J12, the bit that goes over the battery, J15, the cross brace and front battery stop, J7, part of the front gearbox mount, and J11, a post, again for the front gearbox mount. This is all very straightforward. The only thing to keep an eye on is that you use the 2 short screws for J13 and 14. There's a couple of possible places that the parts will fit, most likely for normal and short wheelbase versions of the build, but check the diagram carefully and it should be fine. I found the long screws to be quite tight to get in. I can imagine if you're using a Phillips driver rather than the correct JIS, you might struggle to get them in without slipping. You can add a bit of lube to the threads to make it easier, but you should be okay if you've got the right tools. Add the bulk of the plastic bits until you come to the plastic post. It has a hex moulded in, so we can use a cross wrench to hold it while threading in the screw. Again, it's pretty tight, so you might need a nut driver with a bigger grip or some pliers to hold the cross wrench. Lastly, the steering posts go in. Now they use the 2 M3 screws and just thread straight on. There's no need for any thread lock, just nip them up for now, and in a couple of steps they have nylock nuts fitted, so they're not going to be going anywhere. Step 26, the steering linkage. We need 2 3x10 self-tappers, 3 5mm ball ends, 2 M3x16 threaded shafts, 2 flange tubes, 4 D2 rod ends, J1 and 2 arms, and J8 the drag link. First we'll put the links together. Essentially the rod ends just thread on, and we need to make sure the gap between them is 1.5mm, or at least as close as you can get it. A vernier is ideal, but a ruler will do too. Usually they're going to need a tweak to get the toe in or out just right either way. To fit the rod ends, we grab the shaft with some pliers and thread on the end just a little bit less than halfway. Then we grab the first rod end and thread on the second. Just be careful not to squash the plastic in the pliers, it is fairly soft. Then we set it up so there's a 1.5mm gap. Repeat with the other one, and that's the linkages ready. Next we fit the ball ends. Now the single-ended arm just gets the 1 ball end, and of course the other one gets 2. Both the arms have a right way up, so we need to make sure we get the balls fitted on the right sides. Otherwise it's just a case of threading them in and nipping them up. That just leaves the drag link, which gets attached to the arms with the 3x10s and the flange tubes. We want the flanges to be up against the arms, then the screw can go in and get nipped up. Quite a simple bell crank setup, and while it is a little bit sloppy, it should be plenty good enough. Step 27, fitting the steering. We need the bits we just put together, 2 M3 nylocks and 4 850 bearings. First we'll clip the linkages onto the ball ends with some pliers. Nice and simple, just be careful not to slip the pliers on the brass balls, they're fairly easy to scratch. Next we pop bearings into the arms, 2 in the top and 2 in the bottom. Drop the assembly on the steering posts, thread on the 2 nuts, nip them up, give the steering a quick test to make sure it moves end to end without catching, and that's the steering fitted. Step 28, fitting the gearboxes. We need 3 3x10 self-tappers, 4 3x12 countersunk self-tappers, the prop shaft, the J9 spacer, the chassis and the gearboxes. First we'll line up the spacer using a couple of the countersunk screws. Then we hold the screws in while we offer up the rear gearbox and line it up with the screws. Then we can do up the screws so they're just not quite all the way tight. We still want a little bit of movement so we can get the other bits to line up too. Then on the top of the chassis we can install 2 of the 3x10s. Once they're done up we can nip up the first 2 on the bottom of the chassis. And that's pretty much all that holds the rear gearbox on. I suppose because it's not a rally car, it doesn't need to be extremely robust. I'm sure for smooth track running, it's just fine. The front gearbox sits at the front of the chassis, but before we start fitting it, we need to add the prop shaft, which is a bit of an odd shaft. It's got flattened bits at the ends, almost like little paddles. Before we fit it, we need to add a little bit of anti-wear grease to the paddles. We only need a tiny amount, just a thin coating. Then we slot the shaft into the rear output, then we slot the other end into the front input, and roughly position the gearbox on the chassis. To keep it steady, we can add the 3x10 through the hole in the gearbox assembly near the drive input, which goes into the top of the plastic post. For now, leave it half a turn or so loose so we can line up the bottom screws, which of course we do next. The last two countersunk screws go into the bottom of the gearbox. Nip them up, and then nip up the top screw, and that's the gearboxes fitted to the chassis, which just leaves clipping the steering rod ends onto the uprights. And just like before, we use some pliers, but being very careful not to damage the brass balls. Now we just need to give the steering another quick test, just to make sure it's working nicely. And yeah, it's super free and not crazy sloppy, although if we hold the far right upright for the worst case, there is a bit of slop. Quite usable though, and for a Tamiya, especially a classic, it's pretty good. Right, that's it for this week. A bit short, I know, but next time on the Porsche we're onto the electronics and the final bits of the assembly. We should end up with a running chassis, which will be fun. Until then, as always, thanks for watching. Like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!